Welcome to the Explainer. Today we are taking on a genuinely massive challenge. We're looking at a literal mountain of source material, a dense 5-hour transcript of ancient gospel accounts recording the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. We're talking about chapters spanning Matthew, Luke, and John, and they are just packed with speeches, parables, and some pretty intense debates. It's incredibly dense. But our goal here is to cut through all that noise, synthesize this massive volume of information, and figure out exactly what is going on inside this text. So, let's just dive right in. You know, when you're faced with a text that has so fundamentally shaped global history, it is so easy to get lost in the centuries of commentary, the traditions, the endless interpretations. But what happens if we strip all of that away? If we look strictly and impartially at what the text itself actually says? If you boil it all down, what exactly was the core message? Well, that is the central question we're going to answer today. To digest this massive volume logically, we're going to use a straightforward 4-pillar framework. First, we'll look at the radical ethic of love. Second, teaching through parables. Third, authenticity over empty rituals. And finally, the kingdom and the king. Let's move right to our first pillar, the radical ethic of love, and how the text focuses on flipping power dynamics. Right out of the gate, the text introduces an ethic that flips traditional power dynamics completely upside down. A perfect example of this is a famous section you've probably heard of, known as the Beatitudes, found over in Matthew chapter 5. Now notice exactly who is being elevated here. The text doesn't praise the wealthy, the powerful, or the ruthless, not at all. Instead, it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are the merciful." It actively privileges the marginalized and the vulnerable, promising them the kingdom of heaven and declaring they will inherit the earth. It's a total redefinition of what it actually means to be successful or blessed. Then, the text takes that ancient, sometimes violent standard of eye for eye and tooth for tooth and just completely shatters it. The new instruction is incredibly demanding. It says, do not resist an evil person. Turn the other cheek. And, hey, if someone sues you for your shirt, hand over your coat as well. The absolute climax of this whole framework is the direct command to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It is an ethic of aggressive, nonviolent love. Which brings us to the really unexpected math of forgiveness. In the text, a disciple named Peter asks if he should forgive someone who wrongs him up to 7 times. Now, at the time, offering 7 chances would have seemed extremely generous. But the response he gets? I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. So the crucial takeaway here is that this text isn't just asking for simple tolerance. It's demanding this infinite, exhaustive cycle of grace and forgiveness. So now that we understand the ethic, let's look at Pillar 2, teaching through parables, using stories for the masses. How are these complex ideas actually communicated? Well, the primary tool used is the parable. You have to remember, these teachings weren't structured as academic lectures or rigid legal documents. They were accessible, deeply relatable stories meant for everyday people. The text is literally packed with agrarian metaphors. You've got farmers sowing seeds, mustard seeds growing into massive trees, yeast working through dough, and shepherds looking for lost sheep. It was specifically designed to make profound spiritual lessons instantly recognizable to a first-century audience. Let's look at one of the most famous examples of this from Luke chapter 10, the Good Samaritan. The setup is intense. A man is beaten and left half dead on a road. 2 religious leaders, a priest and a Levite, see him, and they just pass by on the other side. But then a Samaritan, who, importantly, is a cultural outsider and a historical enemy of the audience hearing this story, stops, bandages the man's wounds, and pays for his care out of his own pocket. This brilliant comparison completely redefines the concept of who a neighbor actually is. It's not just the person who looks like you or prays like you, it is the person who shows mercy. And we see how this builds in another masterclass of storytelling, the prodigal son. Here we have a younger brother who wildly squanders his entire inheritance, but returns home broken and repentant, only to be met by a father who physically runs to embrace him. But then there's the older brother. He stayed home, he followed all the rules, yet he refuses to join the celebration out of this bitter jealousy. The story so brilliantly shows that both brothers represent entirely different ways to be lost, one through obvious rebellion, the other through quiet self-righteousness, all while highlighting the father's absolute, unconditional compassion. Let's move to Pillar 3, authenticity over empty rituals, and the demand for internal purity. The text takes a pretty sharp turn here. Because while the source material is incredibly tender toward the broken and marginalized, it issues harsh, almost blistering critiques of performative religion.
Over and over, the text contrasts the outward actions of the religious elites, specifically the Pharisees, with a demanding call for inner purity. It completely condemns those who pray on street corners just to be seen, or who blow trumpets when giving to the poor just to win public applause. Instead, the instruction is radically internal. Give so secretly that your left hand doesn't even know what your right hand is doing. Pray in secret, behind closed doors. This text has absolutely zero tolerance for treating spirituality like a theatrical performance.
In Matthew 23, the language reaches a literal boiling point. The text uses this striking visual metaphor. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. It even goes on to call these hypocrites whitewashed tombs. Beautiful and pristine on the outside, but full of dead bones on the inside. It is an intense, uncompromising demand that your private character must match your public persona. And because of this intense focus on internal authenticity, the text gives a very clear, almost humorous procedure for passing judgment. Before you criticize the tiny speck of sawdust in someone else's eye, you must first notice and remove the massive wooden plank stuck in your own. Only after rigorous, honest self-reflection are you actually equipped to help anyone else. Which brings us to our final pillar, number 4, the kingdom and the king. This is really the theological climax of the text. Here we move from ethics and parables into incredibly bold claims of identity, cosmic authority, and the ultimate destiny of humanity. In the Gospel of John, we see a series of famous I am statements. The first one is, I am the bread of life. The text asserts that just as physical bread sustains the body, the speaker is the ultimate source of deep, eternal spiritual sustenance. As the text reads, whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Then we have the second quote, which introduces this beautiful overarching metaphor of divine protection and belonging. I am the good shepherd. Unlike a hired hand who just runs away when the wolf comes, the text claims that the good shepherd actually lays down his own life for the flock. It is a profound statement of ultimate self-giving sacrifice. And this builds right into a powerful narrative of dependency. I am the true vine. The text argues that individuals are merely branches. Apart from the main vine, they literally can do nothing. But if they remain connected, they'll bear good fruit. It's a metaphor demanding total, constant spiritual integration. But the text doesn't just focus on the present. It looks forcefully into the future. In Matthew 24, we find a dramatic, apocalyptic sequence. It outlines an intervening period of birth pains. We're talking wars, famines, and earthquakes. Then, a time of intense persecution and the rise of false prophets. This leads to massive cosmic upheaval, the sun darkening and stars falling, all culminating in the dramatic return of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven. The repeated warning throughout this entire section is simply, keep watch and be ready, because the exact day or hour is completely unknown. And what happens when that final hour actually arrives? Well, the text provides a startling metaphor for the final judgment, separating humanity like a shepherd separates sheep from goats. But here is the crucial, absolute key point. The criteria for this ultimate cosmic destiny isn't based on how perfectly one followed religious rituals, not at all. It is intrinsically tied to how one treated society's most vulnerable. The sheep are those who fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and welcomed the stranger. The king in the story tells them, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Which brings this entire explainer right back to its core resolution. When asked to identify the greatest commandment in the law, the answer synthesizes everything we've just covered today. It's a dual command. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. The text boldly claims that every single law and all the teachings of the prophets hang entirely on those two instructions. So we've just navigated a massive, ancient historical transcript. We've seen an ethic that demands loving our enemies, parables that totally redefine who our neighbors are, a blistering call for internal authenticity, and sweeping cosmic claims about ultimate justice. So I want to leave you with this thought. How do these ancient calls for radical love, authentic living, and sacrifice continue to challenge our modern moral frameworks today? It's a lot to consider. Think about that the next time you encounter these texts. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today.